here, coming up from the San Francisco Bay Area to talk about the research she's done and the work she does about the subject of her book, Domestic Minor Sex Trafficking. This is an area in which I think all in Alaska are very concerned, and look forward to all that she has to present. So I will not linger long. I will let Alex tell you about her work and tell you about her studies. Welcome.
Thank you. So I've got to say, I'm really appreciative of the turnout. I know we've got some competition with the opioid plan being announced around the same time. So thank you all for taking the time to come to this and hear about the work I've done. So my plan for the next 45 minutes is maybe to take about 20 minutes and share what I've been learning in the research that I've been doing over the past 15 years that focuses on the sex industry, including adults and young people, and folks who have chosen to be in the sex industry, who are there by circumstances, or who are coerced. And I really want to create time at the end, so spend about 20 minutes doing that, create time at the end for questions, for conversation, for dialogues. I know there's also a lot of other experts in the room right now. So the book that Representative Clayman just mentioned came out last year, and what it does is attempt to tell a more nuanced story about the experiences of young people who are involved in the sex industry. So at the federal level, because they're all under the age of 18, they would be considered sex trafficking victims. And what I was seeing from other research I was doing, and having worked doing direct services in the San Francisco Bay Area for a long time, is that main narrative that we were getting through the media of young girls forced into this against their will by bad people wasn't the entire story. And that if that's only the story we're hearing, then some of the policies and programmatic responses aren't going to be able to capture the diversity of young people who are involved in the sex industry. So just to sort of paint a picture of who are these young people, in general, most of the young people involved in the sex industry start between the ages of 15 and 17. And there's lots of different reasons why they're getting involved. So for some, it is the reality of perhaps being housed and not having other basic needs provided for them. And so as young people, it then becomes the challenge of how do you support yourself and get access to food and to clothing and to other things you may need if parents and guardians are not providing that. For others, it's running away from home, getting pushed out of home. It could be that they're fleeing abuse they're experiencing there. It could be that for a variety of reasons, perhaps based on gender identity, sexual orientation, families are not supportive of them. And then out on the streets, they have to find a way to survive. We also hear of, in a smaller percentage, that narrative more of us are familiar with, of young people being forced into this against their will by someone unknown to them. And in the research that I've done, that comes up about 10% of the time, and that seems to be reflected in other research throughout the U.S. And so it sort of highlights the reality that there's specific reasons for many of these young people why they're involved in the sex industry. And so we have to think at this macro level of how better to meet these needs so that either these vulnerabilities they're experiencing aren't taken advantage of by another person, or that they are in a position where they feel like this is my only option, or least worst option, to sell sex to be able to survive. With the research, what I saw is, I was looking at different programs throughout the U.S. and the communities of young people they were serving. And some of the programs were focused specifically on youth in the sex industry. Others were working with a larger umbrella of young people. So it could be marginally housed homeless young folks, it could be LGBT youth, it could be young folks who are involved in the child welfare system. And that matters in terms of how we think of who this involves. So the programs that were not connected with law enforcement, we typically saw an even representation of genders. So young girls, boys, transgender youth were equally represented. With agencies that were working more closely with law enforcement, it was predominantly young women that they were serving. And that's reflected in arrest data as well, where we see that young women are disproportionately arrested at rates higher than young men. And in fact, since the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was passed in 2000, which made anyone under 18 involved in the sex industry a victim of sex trafficking. Up until last year, the arrest rates for young women escalated. At their peak, they were over 300 times more than they were before the TVPA was passed, which seems sort of counterintuitive because you're thinking, wow, they were just classified federally as victims. You would think arrest rates would go down. And instead, what we were seeing is this narrative of we're arresting to protect them. This is the only way that we can get them out of a situation and or sort of encourage them / force them into services. And to me, you know, sort of from a more analytical standpoint, it really points out the gendered nature in the way in which we talk about this. So there's something within our sort of national consciousness that makes us more want to respond to young women who are involved in the sex industry than to young men or to transgender youth. And I think that's really been done at the expense of all of the youth who are involved in the sex industry, because we end up with huge gaps in services for young folks who are not cisgender young girls. The other thing that I really was struck by in the research is if I was listening to media alone, and even some, I think, activist accounts, I would believe that all of these young people had someone exploiting them directly. So it's, be it a pimp, trafficker, whatever language terms we use. What I ended up using in the book was the term third party. And that was a conscious choice because I realized anytime we use the word pimp or trafficker, we can't help but conjure images of specific types of people in our mind. And typically it's gendered and racial. So we're going to think of black men throughout most of the U.S. connected to those terms. And what I found in this research is that in some of the cases, many of the cases in fact, young people did not have a third party involved at all. They were doing this on their own, they figured it out on their own. In other situations, it was connections with peers and friends where they were already outside of the home, figuring out a way to survive, connecting with other marginally housed or street-based homeless youth, and realizing, oh, this is how we can make a living, how we can get our basic needs met, and relying on each other for that type of support. In some, from the legal definition of benefiting from or encouraging somebody to engage in prostitution, it was an intimate partner, and yet it was this discussion among the young people, like, how do we support ourselves in this relationship? And so for one or both parties, it's we're going to sell sex and this is how we do it. And in some, it was that stereotype of either it was an intimate partner where that relationship then became increasingly more violent, or had always started from that point of violence and the young person was truly forced against their will. Similar to what I mentioned earlier, it's also family members. It was moms who were selling their kids for access to drugs or to access to housing. It was fathers, it was aunts, uncles, guardians. But really sort of across the agencies that I interviewed and the young people I spoke to, at most, only 50% of the young people had someone that really fit that stereotypical idea of who a pimp or who a trafficker was. So what were the takeaways from that, right? The key takeaway is this is a very diverse population. It's not homogenous by any means, and the idea that we could have this one-size-fits-all solution ultimately means a lot of young people are not going to benefit from those solutions and sometimes might actually be harmed by them. It also points out that young people rarely think of themselves as victims. Now, over time, some of them may adopt that language, but in the moment when they're involved in the sex industry, most of them are not using that language. And so when it's used by agencies or used in policies or used by advocates, young people aren't going to relate to it. And so it's a missed opportunity to really engage with them because they're like, well, that's not me, so the conversation is over, as opposed to having a conversation of what are the different things that you do to survive, or how are you getting money, how are you getting a place to stay. And then the third thing is recognizing the ways in which, in our attempt to sort of legislate our way out of a problem, to keep making penalties higher and higher and more severe for traffickers, we're unfortunately also capturing young people who are working collaboratively to help each other survive. And so we end up in this situation where the very people that we're trying to help and support are facing criminal charges. And there's no better way to keep somebody in the sex industry longer than they want to than for them to be saddled with a criminal record. The other thing that was really striking and upsetting with the research was hearing about young people's experiences with law enforcement. So because we've prioritized a criminal justice response to this issue, as opposed to perhaps framing it as a human rights issue, it justifies arrest for the sake of services, right? Linking back to this arrest to protect idea. And perhaps if there was data that showed that being arrested is a positive intervention, we could consider that. There's data that suggests otherwise. And perhaps if places had all the services needed to actually support young people, we might also, entertain that idea. But that's not the reality in most places. And unfortunately, what I was hearing from young people is it was very common for them to have experienced exploitation by at least one police officer. And so that could be being physically assaulted, it could be verbal abuse, or sexual abuse. Oftentimes that would take place in the course of undercover operations. So I heard from one case manager talking about a young woman she was working with who was arrested in an undercover operation, saying, got in a car with who I thought was a client. He said, we need to drive to get some money. I said, okay, that's fine. And he let me fondle him for the entire 5-minute drive. And then he arrested me. And if I'm a minor, and he's an adult and a police officer, isn't he not supposed to do that? And so it really highlights the challenge of when some police officers take advantage of this position of power to use it against young people. And then what that means for future efforts. Like, most young people are not going to reach out to law enforcement as an option for support or as someone who could help intervene in a situation when they're experiencing exploitation because of their own lived experience with them or because of the narratives they've heard from their friends. It also then poses challenges, I think, for agencies working closely with law enforcement, because for some young people, when they see that relationship, it makes them much slower to trust that agency because they have lots of reasons to not trust the police. What do we do with this? It's clear to me, if all young people are considered victims, whether they would identify that way or not, they shouldn't be arrested for prostitution-related offenses. And I know different states have different policies, and I also know in some states where policy is that young people are not supposed to be arrested, sometimes they still are. We hear lots of cases about that. And we also know that for those who've already been convicted of these crimes, those records need to be expunged. There's no reason why a young person should have a criminal conviction for prostitution. And we also really have to rethink how we're creating these laws to target supposed traffickers and make sure that when it's young people who are working to support each other, that they're not wrongfully tried as a trafficker, because that basically thwarts any efforts to have a thriving life after that if you're saddled with that type of conviction. In some of my other research, I'm mindful of time right now, with adults, we're seeing similar things in terms of the police. So in a study I did several years ago in San Francisco, we interviewed about 250 women, all who were involved in the sex industry. And of those, 14% reported that they had been threatened with arrest unless they had sex with a police officer. Of those, 2% said even after they had sex with the officer, they were still arrested. And close to 40% reported having experienced either physical abuse, verbal abuse, or sexual assault by police officers. And there are a couple of quotes that I'm going to read because I think it's important to hear other people's voices in this and not just mine from that study of what these experiences are like. So there's 2 quotes. One is from a young woman who is 32 years old and talking about her experience during an undercover operation. And she said, "The first arrest really sucked. I was young. I just wasn't really bright at 20. I didn't know much about my rights or if I could fight back. A female cop and 2 other cops came into my tiny studio apartment with the guy that came as a date. He totally felt me up. It was insane. And then he called me some names, so I thought that kind of sucked too. but I really didn't know, like I really thought he had the right to feel me up. You were doing something wrong, so he had the right to squeeze you and stick his finger up there because you were doing something wrong. And that quote then leads into sort of the key issue is when these behaviors are criminalized, it makes it really hard when someone's rights are violated to come forward and seek any type of justice or support around that. So of that same group of 250 women, 70% reported having called the police at different times for support. Sometimes that was related to their sex work involvement, other times it was related to domestic disputes, other type of issues. And of those women, 40% said the experience was bad or really bad and they would never do it again. And a quote from one woman sort of captures why. It says, when you're prostituting and something happens to you, the police really don't want to help you because you're already committing a crime to them. So it's like, why should they help the criminal? I got robbed, and he said, well, if you would not have been out here prostituting, you would not have gotten robbed. Real ladies are home at 7 p.m. So now what do we do, right? I mean, I think with this type of content, I'm really aware of it can get super dark very quickly, and sometimes we can lose grasp of what type of options do we have to change this narrative and create more opportunities for folks who are involved in the sex industry, whether by choice, circumstances, or coercion, to have their lived experience be better and to have their rights respected. So one thing that we're doing in San Francisco, it would be great to do it statewide, we're starting with what we can, is working on a joint policy between the police department and the district attorney, saying anyone who's involved in the sex industry, regardless of age, regardless if they're being trafficked or not, if they experience a violent crime or witness one while they're engaged in the criminalized activity of prostitution, they can come forward and report it and be guaranteed they will not be arrested for that or any other misdemeanor, nonviolent offenses that they were engaged with at the time. And so that I think having both of those pieces, not just the prostitution-related arrests, but other misdemeanor offenses and drug offenses on there is crucial, because I know that even if someone isn't, say a young person isn't arrested for prostitution, there's lots of other things they're getting arrested for that aren't violent offenses. And so having this assured statement that, hey, if you come forward and report this, you're not going to be arrested, the DA will not prosecute you, could be a first step to mending that relationship and sort of rebuilding trust between folks who are in the sex industry and law enforcement. And what we've learned in research over the years, be it here in the US or internationally, is that oftentimes the first people to see somebody in the sex industry who's being exploited is someone else who's selling sex or someone who's purchasing sex. And so being able to work collaboratively with that group to better address the exploitation that's happening in the industry could be an effective solution. And there's one example of where that's proving to be the case. So in India, there's a group called the Durbar Mahila Samagwaya Committee, and it's a collective of about 65,000 sex workers. They decided back in, probably 2005, that they really wanted to prioritize making sure that no young person was starting to sell sex and that no adults were being forced or coerced into it. So they created their own steering committee and screening boards to assess for this. And in a 2-year period from 2007 to 2009, those regulatory boards that were part of the DMSC identified and assisted 259 young people who were trying to get into the sex industry that they, through their screening, realized you're under 18. Let's, if possible and if it's safe for you, reunite you with your family. If that's not an option, let's find you other safe housing and sort of viable employment options to help you survive. During that same time period, police only identified 90. That's a big difference, and I think really points to the ways in which a community-led strategy, as opposed to one that's driven by law enforcement, could better assist people who are being exploited in the industry. So I think with that, I'm going to pause. It's a lot of information, I realize that, but I really do want to create opportunities for people to ask questions about things that I've said or other aspects of this issue that you're interested in. Yeah?
So I was curious, if police were arresting underage prostitutes, what would they arrest them on if that was taken
So the question, I'm going to repeat it for the recording, is if police were arresting young folks for prostitution, how is that possible if that was taken off the books?
Right.
The reality is it's not off the books. So at the federal level, it's considered a crime. It's considered sex trafficking. Prostitution laws are regulated by the state. So it's up to each state to go in and basically decriminalize youth involvement and remove those criminal statutes from being applicable to youth. Illinois has done it. I'm pretty sure Alaska has done it. Other states have not. But even in those states that have, there's still reports of young people being arrested for it. That charge then gets dropped. Or young people being arrested and charged with other things. Yeah. So in California now, we've, at the state level, decriminalized it, so no one under 18 can be arrested for prostitution. Instead, they're adjudicated to child welfare. That's typically the model that's happening throughout the U.S. I think it's a great step. Any step away from criminal justice involvement is positive. I also know, for example, in California, between 60 to 80% of these young people were already child welfare involved. And so it begs the question, what needs to happen within that system to better support young people? Because if they were already involved, 60 to 80%, what does it mean to send them back to something where they already fell through the cracks? Yeah, it's staggering. It's really staggering. Other questions? Reflections about what you're seeing
So
here?
I know one. So
Sure.
in Fairbanks, I remember when they decriminalized it, because it used to be, working with youth corrections and people, you would get teen prostitutes, right? And you get to work with them. When they decriminalized it, then it almost like it disappeared. Like, I went to a talk on this recently, I thought, well, we don't have it anymore. I haven't seen it in a long time, so it must be good. And then someone said, no, we just don't arrest them anymore, so you never see them. So in the states where they decriminalize it, how are they reaching, how are they finding these kids, and how are they kind of reaching out to help them? And if they're not arresting them, so they come to our attention, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so the question was, if you're not arresting young people, how do you know where they are, and how do you assist them? There are lots of different ways. One way, and I have my critiques of it, it's still law enforcement. So during the course of undercover operations, or a report is made and they go to investigate, if they discover the person is a minor, they connect them with child welfare. So it's not going to show up in the police data, but it will, and if the child welfare system is collecting good data, it'll show up there. There are also a lot of really great peer-led programs for youth that are doing street outreach, that are doing outreach on social media, and they're connecting that way. And, you know, I think by nature of this broad category called child, that starts from the moment you're born up until a day before you're 18, there's lots of different developmental stages there. And yes, there are some very young children involved in this, and the majority are 15 or over. And among that group, they're voting with their feet. So there's a program that really responds well to their needs and allows them to identify what is most important to them and follows that lead and does it in a non-judgmental, supportive way, and is very clear about what is and is not a mandated, sort of mandated reporting issue. Young people keep coming back, and then they tell their friends, and then their friends come in. And so there's lots of ways, without totally relying on law enforcement, that programs are reaching this community of young people.
So I have a question. So you mentioned earlier that it's, and I agree that it's not good for most of these young people to refer to them as victims. But I'm wondering if you've seen or aware of any sort of innovative ways that victim services generally, which is usually who does get brought into these, has found a way to reframe themselves and to do that outreach and that education and that support without making it be about being a victim.
Yeah, the question is recognizing the limitations and challenges of using the term victim. how are organizations sort of recreating themselves if they're a victim service organization to reach the population. And I think there's not a problem for victim service agencies to still have that large umbrella term. What matters is the one-on-one communication and the outreach communication that happens. So young people, even if you didn't use the term victim, but use the term, are you experiencing trafficking? They're not going to identify with that. And so what a lot of organizations have been doing is giving more sort of specific examples of, are you in a relationship you feel stuck in? Which is broad, and that could include a lot of folks, but that's an opening of what's that relationship like and what are the dynamics like. Do you ever feel like you have to do things for money that you'd rather not do? So language that's sort of more accessible and less loaded. But I also think there's some groups that are focused more on empowering young people to be advocates for themselves and equipping them with the skills and resources to do that. So we're seeing a lot of paid internship programs popping up across the U.S., which I think is a great model. One, because young people need money. It's a great affirmation of their skills and their expertise. And for those who have been exploited in the industry, is a great counter-narrative to you can't do anything else. But it also lets young people define for themselves what the issues are they want to work on, say at a policy level. That's what a lot of the programs are. And then they bring in experts who equip the young people with the skills necessary to do that work for themselves. And so it becomes a program where it's not necessarily explicitly of, we want to support you because you've been in the sex industry. It's, you're a young person who's impacted by lots of different things, and we want you to have the opportunity to advocate for yourself. And then in that setting, when young folks feel safe and seen and heard and valued, conversations pop up about their experiences. And it's been beautiful in some of the ones that I've witnessed to see the ways in which young people in some ways do a much better job than adults at being able to hold the complexities and nuances. So in the same space, you can have a young transgender woman saying, well, no, my first time selling sex, it was forced. It was something I absolutely didn't want to do. I felt completely exploited. And yeah, now that I'm a little older, it's something that I go back to every now and again when I need to make ends meet. And then the next person will say, oh, it was a complete choice of mine when I was 16 to do this. It was affirming, I made a lot of money, I felt more support, right? And no one feels as if because someone else's story is different, that makes their story mean anything less. And I think that's sort of what we've run up against in some of the anti-trafficking movements and the efforts in that is prioritizing this one narrative. And then if other realities are presented, it's viewed almost as an attack on the legitimacy of that one. And instead it's expanding it to say this is really complicated and includes a lot of different young people and a lot of different experiences. And if we're really going to be able to respond to this, we have to be able to hold those complexities.
So the interns are the kids? Is that
Yeah,
what you mean?
yeah. So it's a paid internship program for youth.
So when you're doing research, you'll hire an intern to go out and do the interviewing and that kind of
Oh, well, that's another model. Yeah, so this is more within service providers, like service agencies. One of their programs for youth will be an internship. So there's an application process, there's an interview process, which is all professional development. I mean, the young people may not experience it that way, and it's, I think, best if it's not experienced that way, if it's more this organic process. And then it's a small group that's chosen to go through a 6-month or year-long internship where they know they're going to identify a policy issue. There's also the opportunity, so a lot of the research I do has always been informed by sort of the ethical compass of communities impacted by this should be actively involved in doing it. It becomes a little trickier to do that with folks under 18. There's a lot of fine print in grant proposals and sort of guiding documents from funders about who can and cannot get paid for what. But on most of the projects I've led over the past 15 years, there's always people who have either worked in the sex industry by choice, who've been exploited in the sex industry. Maybe it was when they were children and they're over the age of 18 now. But there's also, I think it's easier if it's within a service provision dynamic, that you can do internships for folks under 18 because you're already serving them. Yeah, and it's to me it links back to we really need to hear from those most impacted about what's worked well for them, what hasn't, what they feel is most important, and guide our responses based on that, as opposed to coming in, perhaps if we're outsiders, some of us in this room likely have worked in the industry under 18, some of us may have worked in the industry as adults, and we may or may not be open about it, but making sure it's guided by the folks with lived experience who are in a place where they can talk about that, as opposed to outsiders projecting on to the situation what we think might be best for people without their input.
So, Alex, I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about, I don't know if you have any information about the Celeste Guap case that we've been reading about, and how that might have impacted local law enforcement communities and the larger public.
Yeah, so the question was about the Celeste Guap case. This is a case in the Bay Area in California where a young woman was exploited by police officers before she turned 18, continued to have sexual contact with police officers after the age of 18. And I remember a journalist reached out to me when this story first broke and was shocked about it and asked, like, can you believe this has happened? And I said, unfortunately, absolutely yes. This is what we've been saying for many, many years. This is what research has been showing. What's very different about this case is you have a young woman who's willing to be public about this and who's willing to press charges and participate in that. And there's lots of reasons why folks, regardless of age, would choose not to do that, and I think highlights the importance of not prioritizing prosecution over the needs of the individual. So what we're seeing so far is that there have been very, for the number of police officers implicated in this, there haven't been as many charges coming out as people would have expected. And when there have been charges filed, sort of the penalties associated with it when the person has been convicted of it haven't been as severe as we would think if it's a police officer having not just sex with someone who's underage, but within the context of selling sex, like essentially contributing to the trafficking of a minor and committing statutory rape. So, you know, I think what has resulted in the Bay Area is a more open conversation about the realities and challenges of law enforcement operations. I would like to believe it's going to lead to procedural changes. And I think in some ways the support that we're receiving with this joint policy with the San Francisco Police Department and the DA's office in San Francisco, which should be finalized in the next week or so, might be indicative of the police department saying, okay, yeah, this is an issue. So within that policy, there's also a provision that says it is not permissible, lawful for police officers to have sexual contact with anyone during the course of an undercover operation or police actions. And I think that's really important because if you ask police if that's happening, they're going to say no. Yet the case with Celeste Guap really showed, of course it's happening. The research I've done shows, of course it's happening. And this is a way to make sure police really know that they're going to be held accountable if this becomes known that it's happening. Other questions, thoughts, or critiques? I think it's a sort of a charged issue, and so there might be folks sitting here like, you are so far off on this. And I welcome hearing that too. I think that's how we further these efforts is to have those more critical conversations.
Do you have any figures on like what percentage of the girls, if the average age is like 15, they started at 15, 17. Do you have any figures on like what percentage of teen prostitutes have been in the trade were abused originally as children? Like you mentioned something about the kids in foster care, like 80% of them, which is a little disturbing to me to hear, but
Yeah.
just like physical abuse or sexual abuse, what kind of histories you're looking at for these young ladies?
Yeah, so the question is, do we have data about the types of abuse these young people have experienced prior to engaging in the sex industry. So, you know, all genders are involved. So we've got girls, we've got boys, we have transgender youth. It is really hard to get good data about this because it's a hidden population, right? So in the world of research, that means there's not a list of all the young people who are selling sex. So there's no way you're ever going to get a representative sample. So you rely on these almost convenient samples. Your reflection back is accurate that, wow, in California, if between 60 and 80% were already child welfare involved, that indicates something was going wrong in the household. It may or may not rise to a certain level of physical abuse or sexual abuse, but clearly there was deemed a danger in the household that the child had to be removed. We don't have national data about, you know, how many experienced sexual abuse, for example, as children. In a study I did, though, this was, gosh, probably 6-7 years ago, it was looking at women in San Francisco who were using methamphetamine. And it ended up that half of the sample were currently involved in selling sex. The other half had never sold sex. And I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity, because what's been problematic about a lot of research that talks about rates of childhood sexual abuse among people in the sex industry is it's never compared to another group. So we don't know, is it unique to that group of women, or if you matched it with a comparable group of women, would you see the same thing? I said, wow, we've got a comparable group. They're all drug users. Most of them are poly drug users. Almost all of them were marginally housed or homeless. So sort of doing the statistical analysis, there were no significant demographic differences that would say we can't compare these. And I sort of hypothesized, I said, if we just look at sort of sex trade involvement to the outcome of symptomatology of sexual abuse trauma, we're probably going to see an association. But if we control for other factors, I thought that association was going to go away, because I didn't feel that it was necessarily sex trade involvement that was causing it. It's the larger community and sort of system in which these women were existing. And for the whole sample, the rates of childhood sexual abuse, regardless of sex trade involvement or not, were ridiculously high, close to 70-75%. And so then when we controlled, it was for homelessness and then experiences of sexual abuse as adults that was not linked to sex work, the association fell away. So to me, it again comes back to, for a lot of reasons, many of us feel compelled to focus on, oh, it's the sex industry or selling sex that's creating the issues for folks. And yeah, for some folks there are issues that are created by that, but there are these larger macro level issues that are really creating vulnerabilities for people and putting them in a harm. And so if we want to support folks, it's taking it to that next level and saying, how do we address community violence? How do we address inequitable access to resources such as housing and healthcare and education? How do we make sure folks have supportive networks, whether it's familial or not, so that when things are going wrong in their life, they can turn to somebody and hear what all the different options are. Okay, this is your last chance. We've got time for one more question. So if you're that person, you're that person. Fantastic.
So what about police officers that are taking advantage of the situation? Is anyone looking into better regulatory, or how do you oversee the people that are supposed to oversee the
Good,
law?
yeah, good question. The question is, how do you deal with police officers who are committing crimes against folks in the sex industry? How do you oversee the people who are overseeing the people? I think there's a couple different ways. One is creating policies similar that makes it very explicit that that conduct is not permissible, will be investigated, and will be prosecuted. But then also making sure you have the community resources to support people if and when they want to bring those claims forward. So having that good network in place. I also think it can involve reviewing police training material. So I did a review of a mandated 2-hour human trafficking training that anyone with field or investigative duties with the police department in California have to watch. And, you know, trainings on this issue are important, and they're only as good as their content. And this content had significant issues and basically sort of reiterated this stereotype, which leaves officers ill-equipped to deal with someone who doesn't fit that small narrative, and also promoted sort of using condoms as evidence of trafficking. To me, you don't want to take away health promoting materials. Like, you just don't want to do it. And so they're like, anytime you see a condom, flag it because it could be indicative of trafficking. And the reason why this is interesting, and I think sort of points to what we as individuals can do, is it was written into policy, into the TVPA, and so it really requires us to be critical consumers of policy that's being proposed or legislation, and showing up and voicing when things are wrong, because it added racketeering as something that could be used to show that trafficking was happening, and then it added condoms as evidence of racketeering, because I don't know if when we use condoms, we're often not looking at where it's manufactured. But when you do, it is rare that it's manufactured in the state that you're in. And that's what makes it racketeering, because that condom has moved across state lines, basically. So that's a great way that we can get involved as citizens and say, that's absolutely not acceptable. And even though you think it's going to make it easier to then prosecute somebody for trafficking, we haven't seen an increase in prosecutions of traffickers since that went into effect in around 2005, 2008. Clearly it's not serving its purpose, and perhaps it's adding even more trauma to somebody who is being exploited, that now if the person exploiting them is aware of it, and there have been 2 people charged with that racketeering enhancement, saying, no, you can't use condoms because that might end up in increased sentence time for me, you're creating an opportunity for people to be exposed to sexually transmitted infections, unwanted pregnancy, a whole host of health issues that makes it much harder for them to heal. All right, so we're unfortunately out of time. I would love to keep talking. I have a flight to catch at 2, but I'm going to hang around for about 15 minutes, so for those who maybe don't feel comfortable asking questions in a larger group, feel free to come up. Or if you're that person who takes a little bit longer to process what you're hearing, I have cards up here, so feel free to grab one, and you can always reach out to me afterwards. I'm pretty good. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.